The year is 893. In a forest the maps forgot. A bell never rings. There are no churches here. No stone towers, no stained glass, no carved saints watching from the walls. Only trees. Black, towering, endless. And somewhere deep inside them, a clearing where men of the cross stop being men of the cross. The Chronicle calls it simply the Women's Grove. No coordinates, no precise location, just a warning. From that place, no man ever returned as he was taken. Tonight, 30 Christian prisoners stumble into that grove, hands bound, feet bleeding, armor long since stripped away. They are soldiers from the borderlands, taken in a raid against a pagan tribe that Rome never fully crushed. Men who thought they understood war. They were wrong, because what happens here isn't battle, it isn't execution, it isn't even torture in the way you learned it in school. What happened in this grove is something far more calculated, using intimacy as a weapon, taking everything a man believes about his body, his faith, his masculinity, and turning it into a cage. And the ones who wielded that weapon weren't kings or generals or priests. They were women. If you think you've heard the worst history has to offer, you haven't met the priestesses of the Grove of Neriah. Their story doesn't appear in tourist brochures or classroom textbooks. It lives in the margins of monastic chronicles, in burned letters, in fragments of bone from a pit that should never have been opened. Here on Crimson Historians, this is where we live. In the cracks, in the footnotes, in the stories that make empires look away. Every view, every like, every subscription is another reason to keep digging in the places history tried to bury. So if you're ready to hear what intimate practices meant in the hands of pagan women facing Christian invaders, stay. Because once we step into this grove, there's no going back. To understand what happened to those men, you have to understand who they were. The Annales Carentani, a border chronicle written by a monk named Paulus, lists them like an inventory. 30 men of the Lord, 2 priests, 10 knights, the rest common soldiers. One of them had a name that survived, Brother Leontius of Aquileia, a healer, not a fighter. He rode with the Lord's banner to bless the troops, hear confessions, remind them that God, not steel, decided who lived and who died. They believed they were bringing light into darkness. They didn't realize the darkness had its own rituals, its own gods, its own women who were very tired of watching their sons and lovers die under foreign banners. The tribe they rode against isn't named clearly. Paulus calls them the daughters of Neriah, a pagan goddess older than Rome itself. To him, they're not a people. They're a cult, a threat, an infection. But then he writes something he shouldn't have, something historians 1,000 years later would circle in red ink. Their women do not weep for the fallen. They avenge them with the flesh of their enemies. That sentence is why you're here. The ambush comes at dusk. It's almost boring in its efficiency. A narrow pass, a rain-slick path, a rock slide, then arrows, horses screaming, men thrown to the mud, disarmed before they can even raise their shields. It's a textbook guerrilla tactic, but that's not the part anyone remembered. Because the women come afterward. Not in chaos, not screaming, not wild, organized. They walk into the aftermath in lines, hair braided back, wrists bound with strips of red cloth. Some carry bowls of ash. Some carry knives. None of them carry fear. Paulus, watching from behind a rock as he hides, writes, "They moved among the captured like midwives at a birth, not like mourners at a slaughter." The men are tied upright to carved posts in the clearing, not roughly hammered stakes. Carved posts, weathered with age, marked with spirals and runes. This is not improvisation. This is infrastructure. This has been done before. The youngest of the captives sob. The older ones curse. Brother Leontius prays. The women ignore all of it. One by one they approach the prisoners and begin the first step of the ritual, unmaking, not by breaking bones, by breaking identity. They cut away everything that said soldier, belts, leather, scraps of heraldry. They shear off their hair with small knives, letting it fall in piles at their feet. One man spits in the face of the woman cutting his beard. She just wipes it away and whispers something he doesn't understand. Paulus writes what he thinks she says. No one will recognize you in the next world. Then comes the ash. The women dip their fingers into bowls of blackened dust, burned offerings, pulverized bone, no one knows, and mark each man from forehead to chest. Not with crosses, with inverted shapes, curves that mock the sign of the cross without fully forming it. Not just desecration, replacement. These markings are intimate. Fingers dragging slowly along jawlines, across throats, down sternums, stopping just short of the places every man was taught were private, sacred, the places you only shared with a wife or never spoke of at all. No one is struck, no one is stabbed, yet men start screaming, because in their world, a man's body is a fortress, his skin is his own, his shame is his own, his desire is his own. To be handled, inspected, and marked by strange women in front of your brothers in arms is not just humiliation. It's theological annihilation, and that is just phase one. If you're still watching, you already know this isn't about some lurid fantasy. This is about power. How do we know any of this happened? Not just from Paulus. The monk was half traumatized, half preaching. He saw what he wanted to see. But in 1964, in a valley on the modern Austrian-Slovenian border, archaeologists dug into a hill the locals called Die Hexengrube, the witch's pit. They found posts, they found iron rings driven into stone, and they found something no one expected. Male skeletons buried in a shallow ring, knees drawn to chests, arms bound, pelvises marked with cut marks and strange, deliberate scratches on the bone. Alongside them, offerings, women's jewelry, broken ceramic bowls smeared with a residue of ash and animal fat, and in one corner, a bronze plaque with a design, a man kneeling, a woman standing over him, one hand on his head, the other lifted to the sky. No inscription, just the image. The museum catalog calls it ritual submission iconography. Paulus called it something else. They made altars of baptized bodies. What did that mean? This is where the record goes dark, and where we have to walk a razor's edge. Because the chronicle hints at intimate practices that crossed every boundary the men knew. The words he uses are careful, almost frightened. Pollutions, unholy unions, forced vigils of shame. He refuses to describe details. That's our line too. We are not here to reenact that night. We are here to understand why it was done. The second phase of the ritual is called, in one fragment of a later sermon, the inversion. Imagine being one of those men. You have been stripped, marked, tied. You are surrounded not by executioners, but by women, young, middle-aged, old, who move around you like a choir, not a mob. They chant in a language you don't understand, but every now and then a word cuts through that you do. Father, Son, Spirit, they have taken your words. The priestesses walk among you with bowls of oil and herbs. The smell is overwhelming, sweet, bitter, dizzying. Some of the men grow lightheaded, their hearts pound, their thoughts blur. This is not an accident. We have records from Roman authors describing northern tribes using psychoactive herbs in religious rites. We also have chemical traces from vessels found in that pit. Lab reports show residues of henbane and other plants known to distort perception. In other words, these men weren't just frightened. Their bodies were being pharmacologically pushed to the edge. Why? Because the final step in breaking a prisoner is not pain, it's confusion. If you can make a man doubt his own reactions, his own body, his own thoughts, you can make him doubt his God. Paulus writes that some of the men began to laugh and weep without cause, that some called out to the Virgin Mary in tones that sounded more like longing than supplication. He's horrified by this. From his perspective, their very emotions were being corrupted. From theirs, they were being ripped in half. The women used touch as another tool, a hand gripping a shoulder too long, fingers resting at the base of a throat, bodies leaning in close enough that every man feels their breath. Never outright brutality, never the mercy of clear violence. Just constant ambiguous contact that blurs the line between threat and caress. This is what intimate practice means in this context. Not romance, not seduction, weaponized nearness. The kind that makes you ask yourself, why is my body reacting at all? Why am I shaking? Why is my heart pounding from something that isn't a blade? When faith tells you your body should only respond to what is holy, that question is worse than a wound. There is one part of Paulus's account historians still argue about. He claims that at the height of the rite, the women chose 3 of the prisoners, the youngest, the strongest, and brother Leontius himself, and led them away from the posts. Not to execute them, to join them to the goddess. He refuses to say how. He writes only, "They were bound not by iron, but by flesh. They were used as instruments of a rite that made a mockery of every Christian sacrament. When they were returned to us, they walked, but they were broken. That's all he gives us. And that's all we're taking from him, because beyond that, the line between history and fantasy, between testimony and projection, gets too thin to see. We know these men were subjected to rituals that used their bodies, their shame, and their desires against them. We do not need to recreate it to understand its impact. What matters is what came afterward. If you're still here, you can probably feel it too. This story isn't really about pagans or Christians or some evil women in the woods. It's about what people do when they've been crushed for generations. Remember, these tribes had watched their shrines burned, their sons taken as slaves, their gods mocked in stone homilies. The women of the grove had buried husbands killed under banners marked with crosses. They had been called whores of demons by men who never learned their language. In that grove they discovered a weapon the legions never saw coming. Not the sword, not the spear. Humiliation that leaves no scars you can show in court. Intimacy turned into punishment. The men who survived were released days later, naked, shaved, marked with ash that would take weeks to scrub away. They staggered back to Christian lands in small groups. Paulus met them at the gates of the border fortress. He describes what he saw. They did not cry. They did not rage. They stared through us as though we were ghosts. Some flinched at the touch of a woman. Some flinched at the touch of a priest. One of them, when I made the sign of the cross over him, retched as though poisoned. No broken bones, no missing limbs, but something in them had been torn out and rearranged. The local lord wanted to send them back into battle. The bishop refused. He ordered them into a monastery instead. Not as monks, as a warning. They were put to work in the kitchens, the gardens, the lowest tasks. Not because they were being punished, but because no one knew what to do with men who could no longer be soldiers, no longer be husbands, no longer kneel at the altar without shaking. A few years later, a traveling preacher came through the region. He told a different version of the story, one where those same men had fallen willingly into pagan orgies, where their faith had failed, where the real lesson was, see how lust destroys even the holy. That sermon survives in a single copy. You can almost hear the shame hardening into accusation. Victims turned into warnings. Trauma turned into theology. Sound familiar? Centuries later, when archaeologists stood in that pit, measuring those bones and tracing those runes with gloved fingers, one of them reportedly said, "Whatever happened here, it wasn't simple." That might be the most honest line in the whole story. Because this isn't a fairy tale where pagans are monsters and Christians are saints, or the other way around. It's not a horror movie with clean heroes and villains. It's a story about what happens when people discover that if you can't win with swords, you can win with shame. And it asks a question we're still bad at answering. When power uses the most private parts of a person, their body, their desire, their sense of purity, as a battlefield, how do you write that down without either sanitizing it or exploiting it? Paulus chose to hint and fall silent. The preacher chose to blame the victims. The modern world mostly chose to forget. You just chose to listen. So why does this story matter now? Not because pagan women were evil seductresses. They weren't tropes. They were human beings in a world where men with crosses had burned their fields and hanged their kin. Not because Christian men were weak. They weren't. They were soldiers who had seen combat and still broke when the battlefield moved inside their own skin. It matters because it shows us something we're still terrified to admit. You can torture a person without a single lash. You can shatter a faith without burning a church. You can conquer an enemy without drawing a sword, if you know how to turn their most intimate boundaries against them. Today, we call it psychological warfare. Back then, they just called it vengeance made sacred. The grove is gone now. The posts rot in a museum storeroom. The women of Noriah have no names we can read, no faces we can draw. The men who walked out of that forest have no graves we can visit. But the story survived. In a monk's shaking handwriting, in a pit of bones, in a bronze plaque showing a man on his knees. History is written by the victors. But the most dangerous parts of history, those are written by the survivors who can't quite say what happened, and still try. If stories like this force you to ask uncomfortable questions about power, faith, and what people do in the dark when no one is supposed to remember, then this is your channel. Subscribe to Crimson Historians, not for the algorithms, but for the ghosts. Because some chapters of the past were never meant to be read. We open them anyway.